Okay, so this next pattern is going to be, I'm going to call this the build up or the layer cake pattern. It's good for uncovering information that is highly categorized or highly sorted. So if you're trying to uncover certain information, it gets sorted in certain categories, or you're trying to uh, identify who has ownership in a specific process, this is a great choice. And I use this pattern very often when I was at OutSystems, when I was talking to product owners about where in their software development lifecycle we would show improvement. The goal of low code is to automate the processes necessary to produce high quality software and highly secure software and assemble the infrastructure when it's built and automatically plug it into the observability systems and things like that. The things that you would be doing manually or the developer would need to do manually in the code. And all of that should be taken care of so that the product owner can produce a high quality, very highly secure outcome without putting more effort in, essentially. So when you look at the CI/CD process, which is where I would apply this, it's a very prescriptive pipeline process where it has very specific steps in it, but everyone does the process differently. So it has the same steps or similar steps, but then every single person you would talk to does something different. So in order to identify what they might be doing, I would have to map each and every one of those things and the owners in their company to that process. And it would be different for every company. So I use this pattern to do that. And I'm going to show you this example. Okay, so when I was thinking about how to show what functions were being taken over or what they would integrate to, I would encourage you to, you're always trying to look for recognizable patterns. So the CI/CD pipeline is a very recognizable pattern. So I wanted to start there. So I Googled for the CI/CD pipeline and I looked for images and scroll down. Now, the most common way to see the CI/CD pipeline today is a diagram like you see on the top here that I've circled, where it's more like an infinity loop or it's a loop because the CI/CD process is meant to be circular. Now, this was not helpful to me at all because even though it had the phases of the cycle, this would be a disaster if I was trying to like label this diagram. This takes up a lot of real estate on the screen, and also things would be kind of jumbled. We want to make it clear and readable. So I sort of settled on some of these older diagrams. If you look at some of these other ones I'm clicking on here, these are laid out much more linearly. And especially I'm trying to figure out who does what, where, when, the ownership of each thing, the technology that drives it, or the person that does the process. I'm going to have to label, it's going to be different for every single one of these steps. So I need to label every one. So drawing it this way is going to be really helpful to me because I can maybe put on the bottom and then I have all this real estate to label it as we go along. So this is where I started looking like, okay, I need to draw out this pipeline linearly and I'm going to look at the steps to do it. So I would poke around and look for diagrams that were laid out like this. And then I started with a diagram like this, and then I went to the board and thought about what I wanted to do. A lot of tools like Google Slides or Microsoft PowerPoint will actually have capability to do this in SmartArt. Like a lot of common patterns or layout is already expressed for you in a lot of different ways. So because I was looking for, essentially a pipeline, this or a process, this pattern already exists in a lot of different nice graphics. And the beauty of using one of these, I could select one like you have here. And then when I click on it, I can just type in the phases of build. And the CI/CD pipeline has been evolving for the past 15 years. So I want to make sure that I choose something like this because there's like another step that's going to show up, or as people learn more about the process, this might still change over time. So this is good. This is helpful. It's just going to give me a way to do that. I went back to, the documentation and the diagrams, and I just sort of wrote down the steps of the CI/CD process generally, and I laid them out here, which is good. So to make it more recognizable, I added these backwards arrows. These were more common in older diagrams, but by doing this, I'm showing the product owners a very, very familiar pattern. They're used to seeing this, and so they know what this means. And this is good. It means we're all speaking the same language when we go through this process. The next thing I have to do is I have to understand the technologies and the owners. And because I'll go back and ask, like, who's doing this, like, who's on this team, who owns this process or this responsibility ultimately, because it's not about the tool they're choosing to do it. It's the fact that whether they're doing it or not, and if they're using a tool to do it, we're either going to replace that functionality in the platform, it's going to do it for them, or it's going to integrate to like maybe a bigger system if they're a bigger development organization. Maybe a bigger system does this for all the code, and they have a different owner and they view it on a different screen. So I have to uncover all of that. So I laid out, owners, technologies. So for every one of these phases, I would then have to ask, how do they accomplish that? And for each one of these phases, this one has a goal. The goal is to do the thing in the phase, right? You have to version control your code to get this outcome. You have to build it automatically. So this was what I would ask. The next thing I would do is I would look at building a vocabulary for this, which is actually pretty straightforward as you learn a lot about software development. If you've been in the field or you talk to product owners, it's pretty common to understand what technologies might assist these things. And so the next thing I did was I would look for those things, and I would save off a lot of them into my vocabulary. So this is, I'm going to give you this example of this finished product, but basically when I was looking at doing this for a product owner, at this point we were doing this both in person and remotely. And also right around COVID is where I started using this pattern pretty frequently. So I really mostly did this pattern electronically on a Zoom versus in person a lot. I think I did it once in person, but ultimately most of the time I did this, it would be in Zoom. And so you can see here, I've already built up a significant amount of that vocabulary on the right-hand side because I would listen for what people would tell me, and then I would just save these logos. And if I didn't know what it was, I would just copy and paste like this text or this text and drag it over. And then later on, after I transcribed, I would go find the logo and stick it back in my template. So this became the template now that I would use. So the way this would work is we would explain the premise of low code, and then we would ask how they did it today. And it's pretty straightforward, right? If you're building these things, if your interest is in having good quality outcomes, in saving time on build, where they were at in this phase really would tell us, where they were at in their journey. So I would just ask them, first of all, I would start with the orchestrator, and I would ask what it would be, and they would tell me, and we would write it down. And then I would ask for each one, like what they were using for regular code, because when you write regular code, you have to do this yourself, right? You have to go reach out to the tool. You have to store your artifacts somewhere. You have to document things. You have to automatically deploy that code. You have to test it, and then you have to deploy it to production on some infrastructure somewhere and assemble that infrastructure. And then you have to observe it while it's in production so that that feedback is going to get it, and feed the subsequent sprints. And a lot of times they would tell me the technology, or they would tell me the person. Maybe like this was not automated. The person who did testing was, Jerry. And so I would write Jerry, which is funny, but it's true. And then usually after we would do this, then either in the meeting or in subsequent meetings, I would point out the value. Like we would get rid of some of these things. Typically, we would get rid of at least the automated deployment because the platform assembles low code and deploys it. So for all low code platforms, this would not be something you'd have to build at all. You'd not have to build a CloudFormation template or anything because you could just deploy it. So naturally that would get X'd out. And then other things would get X'd out depending on, what they did and what they were trying to do. I would also write down the owners up top because many different people were usually responsible for this process. And I would have to convince them, usually they weren't in the meeting. And so I would have to convince them, they would become like a stakeholder that I have to go talk to and convince them that this was the right investment. So I would have to identify them. And so this was a good way to kind of suss out, like, who have I not talked to in your organization? I probably haven't talked to the operations people. They're kind of at the end. So we need to go talk to them for sure at some point, make sure they have some buy-in. So this was a great way to suss that out. I would write them all on this board. And then at the end of the meeting, we would take this output, I would transcribe it very quickly. And in this case, there was not a lot of transcription at the end because I had built up such a good vocabulary. I was just dragging it on the screen. And that was it. And then we'd be able to send it to them. And each one of these things, each one of these X's represents dollars. Like, there's a cost that they don't have to pay. That's an optimization that they can gain. So this was a way for me, I could immediately return this and say, this is what we discussed, kind of, this is how you've laid out on one screen. This is what your team does. These are the owners. And these are how each owner can benefit from this process. It would tell me, like, essentially all the people who would benefit. And then we could work out how they would benefit based on the answers. So this was very, very effective. And I've done other things like this where we've laid out the security models. We've done this over like security models, which are typically layer cake. And we've shown that we have more coverage there. So this build-up pattern, layer cake pattern, is quite good for trying to show essentially all the things that your product is doing. If you have a product that's taking over a lot of things, or if you have something that needs to be sorted or identifying different owners, this is a great pattern that you might use to do that.